Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Wilson Center today. I'm Kelly Wicker, Director of the Science and Technology Innovation Program here at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this important panel discussion on the impacts of last year's flurry of federal activity and investment on semiconductor resilience. I want to thank two of my fellow Wilson programs, the WABA Institute for Strategic Competition and our Global Europe program, for their support in hosting this panel. After seeing the economic and societal impact of the global semiconductor shortage, Congress and the Biden administration took steps to deepen American chip supply resilience. Now, a year out from the passage of the CHIPS Act, one of the key pieces of legislation in this push, we want to look and reflect on what we're seeing in chip supplies, geopolitical ties, and more as we get deeper into implementing investments and controls. We'll continue this series this fall with detailed looks at aspects of this implementation, from impacts on legacy production to anticipated workforce needs and challenges and beyond. And I hope you'll join us for future virtual panels. We're joined today by three exceptional panelists today, and I'm going to let our moderator, Wilson Fellow and Commerce Department veteran Cordell Hull, introduce them to you and get us started. Cordell, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to everybody for joining. As Kelly said, we're delighted to be joined by three exceptionally talented panelists, starting with Farouz Saad, who is the Director of Public Engagement in the CHIPS office at my old home, the Department of Commerce. Welcome. Jay Morgan is Senior Policy Manager at the Representative of German Industry and Trade. And last but not least, Jimmy Goodrich, Vice President of Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association. Thank you all for joining us. What I wanted to do is start and give the panelists just a couple of minutes, if they wanted to just give some framing comments. So Farouz, I could start with you.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Well, I apologize. I don't know why my screen is blacked out. Everyone could just see me a second ago, so I'm so sorry. But I will just jump into it nonetheless, because I imagine what I have to say is more important than what I look like. So first, thank you again for the invitation to speak with you all here today and for hosting this event. This is exactly what we want to do more of within the CHIPS office, and ensuring that we are elevating kind of the CHIPS and Science Act and certainly kind of our implementations thus far. So let me start from the beginning and kind of quickly get through everything we've done so far. So a little over a year ago, the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act was signed into law. And not long after that, the CHIPS office was launched at the Department of Commerce. Since we've been hitting the ground running, last year about this time, we had began engaging a wide range of stakeholders from across the ecosystem, industry, labor, national security organizations, that all led to the creation and now implementation of the CHIPS strategy. We also launched the Industry Advisory Committee, or IAC, which has already held about 2 or 3 public meetings. As you all probably know, along with the creation and passage of the CHIPS and Science Act, Congress allocated $52 billion, $39 billion for manufacturing incentives, and $11 billion for research and development. And as such, the CHIPS office was created along those 2 streams. So our CHIPS program office, which is covers the manufacturing incentives, and then, or CPO as we refer to ourselves, in the CHIPS R&D office, or CRDO, on the R&D side. Earlier this year, we launched on the incentive side our first notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO, for leading edge and mature node chips manufacturers. And then at the end of June, we updated that NOFO to include large scale supply chain projects of $300 million or more. Along with these NOFOs and funding opportunities, we also released a bunch of paper to help kind of guide applicants and the ecosystem in general on how to submit a successful application, but also how do others within the ecosystem fit into these funding applications and into our kind of vision and strategy here. And so that included our vision and strategy paper, which laid out 4 goals: establish and expand domestic production of leading edge and semiconductors in the U.S., of which the U.S. currently makes 0% of the world's supply. Build a sufficient and stable supply of mature node semiconductors. Invest in R&D to ensure the next generation of semiconductor technology is developed and produced in the U.S., and of course, create tens of thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs, more than 100,000 construction jobs. So that's the goals that we laid out. But in addition, there's a workforce plan, environmental questionnaire, just you name it, kind of a slew of resources that we've made available to ensure that applicants and those within the ecosystem can have the information that they need to submit a successful application. Since we've had over 500 SOIs or statements of interest and 100 pre-applications and applications from over 42 states across the country. So surely seeing the need for these investments, the interest in the investments, and the excitement around onshoring chips manufacturing and semiconductor production here in the U.S. And so there's a lot more to say, but I'm going to just kind of keep my remarks here as brief as possible and hope to get into some of the more specifics as the discussion goes on.
Thanks, Farouz. And I was remiss at the top of the call of the meeting not to say we have a chat box on your screen for the audience to submit questions. We hope we'll have plenty of time to get into some of the questions later in the program. Jay, can I turn it over to you for your opening remarks?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Cordell, and thanks to the Wilson Center for having me. My name is Jay Morgan. I work at the Representative of German Industry and Trade. We are the Washington Liaison Office for the Federation of German Industries, the BDI, as well as the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the DIHK. Taken together, our 2 parent organizations represent essentially the entire German business community, and it's our job to speak in the common interests of the German business community here in DC. Just a few of my favorite quick facts and numbers about German business presence in the United States, just to set the table. There are about 5,800 German companies operating across the United States. German foreign direct investment in the US totals around $620 billion, and that amount has more than doubled over the last 10 years. And German companies employ about 900,000 Americans in all 50 states, and making Germany the 3rd largest foreign employer in the US, behind just the UK and Japan. In terms of the topic agenda today, I think just to set the table at a broad level, the last few years have definitely been a wake-up call for the German business community, as other business and policy communities the world over, with a new focus on resilience. So supply chain disruptions brought on by the pandemic, as well as by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have directly impacted the German economy. And as such, the German business community welcomes investments in resilience and also supports friendshoring efforts on both sides of the Atlantic. We're definitely happy to see coordination on semiconductor supply chains through Working Group 3 of the TTC, and look forward to keep monitoring the implementation there. We're happy to see that neither side wants a subsidies raise. We do have 2 broad areas of concern in this policy area. One are the domestic content requirements in sort of the broader industrial policy space that we see as undercutting the idea of friendshoring. And secondly, extraterritorial restrictions like the export controls implemented last October or the upcoming outbound investment screening from the recent executive order can lead to a chilling effect on investment even within friendly and partner countries. So just want to reiterate that open markets can also contribute to resilience in diversifying supply chains. I think a particularly poignant example of an entirely domestic supply chain that is not resilient, or was not resilient, was the baby formula supply chain in the United States. So that was one that was entirely onshored here in the US, but was still subject to single points of failure. So in terms of diversifying and reindustrializing both in the United States and Europe, we're very supportive of the efforts that the CHIPS Act is pushing, and look forward to see coordination efforts and cooperation efforts in the sort of broader transatlantic economic area.
Thanks, Jay. Jimmy, over to you.
Well, thanks, Cordell, and happy to be here with a number of esteemed other panelists from government, industry, and our international counterparts. This is really a very critical topic. As the ship industry that we've already talked about is global from top to bottom. Really, every aspect of the supply chain, every aspect of the manufacturing and chip design process is about as globalized as it can be, and its markets are also globally distributed. And it's probably one of the shining examples of globally interdependent distributed supply chains with thousands of suppliers, complex processes. And in fact, we've done some studies that shown that from a chip's initial design to its actual shipment to a customer, it might take up to a year for that process to happen or longer. It might traverse the globe 3 or 4 times, and it goes through an array of different supply chain partners. So working together is really critical. And we also, for example, share a number of the same challenges, being the US, with our allies and partners. I think after COVID-19, it all taught us that being too dependent on one region for production of essential items is not a politically sustainable and secure way to ensure the resilience of our supply chains. And so we're just really thrilled to see the passage of the CHIPS Act here in the United States moving into implementation, the counterpart efforts in Europe on behalf of the EU CHIPS Act, Japan is getting into the game, even India, Thailand, Vietnam, Mexico, many other economies are trying to understand how they can play a role in this bigger game of supply chain rebalancing. So that's why international collaboration is really important, whether it's with the US and Europe or other partners, to try and understand what the common rules are going to be. How can we work together to try and resolve some of these supply chain vulnerabilities, avoid redundant and repetitive investments, coordinate trade policy so that while we're all rebuilding chip production in our own borders, we still have a market to sell to at the end of the day. It's going to be worthless if we can't export and compete globally, whether you're in Germany or in the United States. And then, of course, on the defensive side, on whether it's outbound investment, export control, sanctions, ensuring that it's a level playing field and that everyone's working together to try and achieve a common objective in a way that doesn't unduly impact the innovation in the commercial sector. So there's a huge range of issues. I think it's fantastic that the CHIPS Program Office has stood up an international engagement office. The State Department is also really engaged. We're engaged as a private sector partner. And we just think that type of coordination is just really critical. And it's good to see that now the OECD is taking on a role in coordinating global semiconductor policy as well. So there's a lot of good efforts underway. We have to just try and ensure that we're all kind of rowing in the same direction. I think we are, but in a way that benefits everybody, because I've spent a lot of my time traveling around different parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Europe, and there's still a little of anxiety over what the US is doing, some misunderstandings around the intention of its policy, and a fear that the US might be undercutting the industrial competitiveness of our own allies and partners. That's just not the case. We're actually going to grow the economy for everyone, but so there's a strong role for sort of economic diplomacy here as well, in ensuring that our allies and partners understand the US policy intentions. So that's kind of some of my initial thoughts, but look forward to the rest of the discussion, Cordell, with colleagues on the panel.
Well, thanks to you all. And Farouz, if I could start with you, I know last week we saw the introduction of the CHIPS Act guardrails. That was something that Congress was, of course, concerned about in passing the legislation. I was wondering if you could just lay out sort of a little bit of a marker on where we've been the last couple of months and what sort of mileposts we're going to see in the next couple of months from the department.
Sure, I'll talk about kind of to build on what I already said in my opening introduction. So So again, on the incentive side, we've now had at least 1.5 announcements of funding opportunities. The last announcement kind of being an update to the first. Have put out a NOFA where we're likely to see very, very soon our next notice of funding opportunity that'll pertain to smaller scale supply chain projects under 300 million. Within that supply chain opportunity, I mean, you'll really kind of see how it complements our first supply chain NOFO for the larger supply chain projects, and really ensuring that we're able to open up this opportunity to all the supply chain within the ecosystem. So with the second supply chain notice of funding opportunity, without getting too much into details, knowing that everyone will have a chance to learn more very soon. There'll be things like consortium applications are really encouraged. And so really encouraging applicants to think about how they can compete and build a resilient supply chain within this market. So does it include an application with a local labor union or, some sort of workforce development organization? How are they kind of building upon the ecosystem and strengthening it within the communities that these are being built? So that's just kind of one way that we're really thinking about our supply chain opportunities and really ensuring that we're doing everything we can to invest thoughtfully. And then our final notice of funding opportunity will be for R&D facilities. And that is still TBD on when we'll see it, but nevertheless, this one will be for, the policy around it is still coming together, but essentially for the expansion of R&D facilities. And then what I didn't get into was on the R&D side itself. And so in April, we released our vision and strategy paper for the National Semiconductor Technology Center, or NSTC. This is really meant to be the hub of our R&D programming, and where, hopefully we'll really see a lot of that innovation, collaboration, workforce development coming together. Over the summer, there's a selection committee that the NSTC is really meant to be a public-private partnership, so its own nonprofit entity. And so as a result, it has kind of a convoluted governing structure to ensure that it complements that. So first was a selection committee that came together through a federal registry notice, so public nominations. They are hopefully soon set to pick a board of trustees. That board of trustees will then create the NSTC operator, the nonprofit entity, and select an executive director. And hopefully we will see all that before the end of the year. And then we'll really see a lot kind of coming out of the NSTC in terms of, the R&D programming, workforce development, and its membership structure. So really ensuring that the NSTC is a center that can kind of bring all of those in, is inclusive to bring those from across the ecosystem in on our, on the innovative pieces of this. And then finally, I'll say also in relation to the NSTC is that while itself it'll be, there will be an NSTC headquarters. It's almost going to be like a hub and spoke model, and so the NSTC will then kind of create technical centers across the country, and what those look like, where they will be, this is all still TBD because it's really meant to be determined by this separate board of trustees and operator that will hopefully come together very soon. So those are just kind of some of what we've seen, some of the big announcements that have come out of both the CHIPS program office and the CHIPS R&D office.
Thanks, Ferouz. That's quite an undertaking. If we could, I'd like to jump across the pond and Jimmy and Jay, turn it over to you. You both raised the EU and some member state things during your opening. And Jimmy, I was wondering if you would just give us a little bit of a level set on what the EU program looks like for those who may not be quite as familiar as those with the US program.
Maybe Jay, you want to take that a little bit and I can add some color?
Sure, I can start off there a little bit. I know the EU financing structure is different from the US, where a lot of the incentive funding is provided by the member states in addition to projects funded by the EU itself. The breakdown in the across the three pillars, which I can let Jimmy go into a little bit more detail, is also different from the prioritization across from the US. But yeah, Jimmy, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a kind of a designed as a counterpart to the US CHIPS Act, but very much with its own set of European characteristics, as it should. Obviously the Commission under the leadership of Thierry Breton has put together the initial CHIPS Act package. It was around the same amount, 50+ billion euros. And it was recently passed and adopted by the Parliament and the Commission. However, it includes several components, and the funding sources are a bit different than the US. The US, all of the 52 billion is being appropriated from Congress, whereas on the EU CHIPS side, one, there's a little bit more broader scope on the policy tools, and I'll talk about that. And then there's also a more diverse range of funds. Basically, only about 8 to 10 billion of those euros is coming from the Commission directly. The rest of it's committed funding from the member states like France, Spain, Italy, and Germany. And most of that funding is COVID spending that was reallocated for semiconductor investments that the European Union approved, because the European Union is very strict state aid rules that describe when and how member states can subsidize an industry. And so that CHIPS Act was really important as like an authorization for the member states to go ahead and begin these projects. But they also need to still get EU approval once, like a project in Germany has been all spun up. The German government has the approval from the Commission to go ahead and negotiate it, but then the final details have to go back to the Commission for approval. So right now there's a number of projects in Germany and France and Spain that are kind of going through that process. Some have actually already been approved. Then there's a second pillar, much like the US CHIPS Act, focused on R&D. That's where a lot of the EU member state, the EU level funding is going to. Projects like the important project of common European interest, which is a microelectronics program, IPCEI, focused on R&D investments going to places like IMEC in Netherlands. And then there's a third pillar, which is on sort of supply chain vulnerabilities, tracking the market, identifying the next shortage, and in some cases restricting exports if there's a constraining environment like a pandemic. And that's really, I think, Europe's lesson from the pandemic. But it may not be completely applicable really to the actual conditions of the semiconductor industry. What might make sense for pharmaceuticals may not make sense for semiconductors. So sorry, long kind of story short, but that's kind of the details and the skinny of what's happening in Europe.
That was a very good lay down. This is a question I'd like each of you to address, and perhaps Jay, I'll start with you first. What's been the biggest surprise for the US CHIPS Act, whether through something that got in or through, actually, let's focus on implementation. What's been the biggest surprise to you for implementation of the CHIPS Act? And then I'll go to Jimmy and then Farouz.
Sure. I think maybe less of a surprise, but something that we were definitely very happy to see actually has to do with the recently issued final rule. And I definitely just want to thank Farouz and the CHIPS Program Office for all of their great stakeholder engagement and engagement with our team, as well as with our headquarters. We've been working on this issue since Commerce issued the request for information on semiconductor supply chains, prior to CHIPS Act being passed. But on the final rule, there's buried in there is a clarification on the definition of foreign entity of concern that actually impacts German companies directly. So what it does is it removes the inclusion of of nationals of countries of concern, so citizens or permanent residents of Russia, Iran, North Korea, or China, living in third countries. And so previously it could have been interpreted such that if you had employees of those companies, that you might, be subject to these clawbacks of investment. And so luckily, this clarification mitigates that risk. There's also a clarification of ownership threshold for what constitutes a foreign entity of concern. So it's at a 25% threshold. But we had an example of a company in Germany reach out to us over losing a customer in the US because they had Iranian technicians working on a product that they developed and produced in Germany. They worked on making sensors for game controllers, among other things. And because of that, they lost a customer in the United States over concern related to export controls as well as investment guardrails. So this is an example, I think, in this example shows kind of over compliance, but it does show the kind of the risks of these restrictions, from an entirely understandable perspective from the U.S. policymaker approach to economic competition and strategic competition with geopolitical rivals that can have sort of unwanted externalities or unwanted side effects for our allies and partners.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Well, obviously, we know and fully support, the CHIPS Act, and we're really excited to see the momentum that's moving forward already. As our colleague from the CHIPS Program Office has already talked about, there's a tremendous amount of interest. Around $200 billion in new committed investments were announced from the beginning of the formulation of the CHIPS Act till today. It's a huge number. So there's a lot of pent-up demand and investment that's ready to move forward to support the CHIPS Act. 500 statements of interest, over 100 applications. Obviously, this is a new area and territory as well for the US. So trying to sift through the regulatory requirements, many of which are still being formulated, what it means for companies' ongoing operations in countries of concern like China. How does a major company that has 10,000 construction workers on a site for them, none of which of them are employed directly by them, but by 3 layers removed subcontractors, how do they ensure there's daycare for that army of construction personnel at the site? All these are, really complex issues that require a lot of really careful and diligent thinking and a lot of new opportunities for law firms and consulting companies, et cetera, to help these big firms figure this out, because even some of the biggest companies can't figure it out. It's very complex. And we would expect really nothing less from a major historical undertaking. We know this is new territory. It's going to take some time. The only challenge is that it is a global market. There's many other economies out there who have been doing industrial policy for a very long time. And they are very aggressive in trying to attract many of these semiconductor investments. They may not be attracting those that have already been committed away from the US, but new investments. And these are many countries who they negotiate the deals one-on-one. They don't have a set of rigid regulatory requirements, so they have a high degree of flexibility. Think Singapore, Japan, and they move very, very quickly. A good example is that after the CHIPS Act started its discussions, and after, for example, some of the companies made announcements here in the US, a year after, they've made similar announcements in Japan. Their factories have been built twice the speed that they're being built here, and they've received those government subsidies almost immediately upon commencement of the project, where we're still kind of going through the process here in the US. And so I just think we have to be mindful that we have all of our rules and approaches for the right reasons, but others may not. And we just have to understand what the implications of that are for the long-term competitiveness of the CHIPS Act here in the US.
That's a very good point. It's been a number of decades since we've done industrial policy on any sort of scale. So the challenges that come with that. Firuz, from your perspective, what's been the biggest surprise?
Sure. So I will say that it's really been the speed at which we are moving. As someone who's worked at all levels of government, state, local, federal, I have never seen government move so quickly. Last year at this time, the CHIPS office had 2 people. Now we have over 150 just on the CHIPS program office side, and on the CRDO side, we're growing. We've put out notice of funding opportunities, vision and strategy papers. sectors. I mean, so on and so forth, everything that I've kind of said here today and been able to highlight. And you know, for government, that's pretty quick. And personally, I think it just doesn't get said enough. I know in general, people want government to move quicker and faster on all ends, but I will say, you know, due to the support of the Biden administration and the secretary's leadership, we really have been moving quite quickly to get this done as quick as possible.
Very good. Well, Jimmy Firuz and Jay, I'd like to turn it to you. So we've talked a lot about subsidies. Jimmy's talked about it too, and maybe I'll bring him in as well. But subsidy programs around the world, how do we take care to ensure that this race for subsidies doesn't produce market inefficiencies? How can we ensure that countries are coordinating so not everyone is trying to build sub-7 nanometer chips to really ensure that we're hitting the patchwork of the supply chain that we need to hit? So Jay, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, I think on that front, the TTC is a great coordination mechanism, and we definitely look forward to seeing more, concrete outcomes on the secure supply chain side in coordinating the implementation of the semiconductor subsidies on both sides of the Atlantic. I think the core here is that the semiconductor subsidies should be tailored to meet market demand and to meet demand both where it is as well as where it's projected to be. So understandably, policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic have a lot of focus on leading edge chips. And I think also with the AI revolution, that focus is only going to become more acute. We need to understand that mature nodes have existing demand for a lot of critical sectors, both from autos to consumer appliances to industrial machinery. And those are capacities that are force multipliers for other areas as well. So in terms of what we define as critical, and even what we define as leading edge, I think just needs to encompass the broad set of demand base. And then also in terms of where we target investments, we're very happy to see the inclusion of materials and equipment manufacturing in the subsidy program. And so making sure that we're hitting really at all levels of the supply chain in order to build out capacities there so that we're not hit by bottlenecks.
And Firuz, your perspective?
I apologize. I'm dealing with technical issues. Do you mind restating the question?
Not at all. We've talked a little bit today about the competing race for subsidies throughout other countries, the EU. Jimmy mentioned Japan and India. And so how can we be sure that we're not introducing inefficiencies into the market? And how can we ensure that countries are coordinating so not everyone is racing to get to the same leading edge chip, and really ensuring the patchwork of the supply chain is covered through subsidies?
No, absolutely. I mean, well, first I will say, and most importantly, because the secretary has said this again and again, right, that really the CHIPS Act is meant to catalyze private investment and not replace it. And so we're really thinking about that throughout our investment strategies. And furthermore, a thoughtful investment strategy will prioritize partnerships with countries that respect fundamental norms and values, countries we rely on around transparency, open and fair rules, based trade, workers' rights, equity and opportunity, and so on and so forth. A lot of the values that we here in the U.S. really follow, and by raising standards in other countries around the world, we can relieve the downward pressure on American wages and environmental standards. Our approach with our allies and partners also prioritizes relationships with countries that can complement and amplify our efforts at home, rather than competing in a way that benefits our adversaries. And so, we're coordinating on issues like trade, international standards, where we can rebuild our relationships and create stronger economies. Secretary Raimondo has made it clear that the goal for these manufacturing incentives is to support a healthy global semiconductor ecosystem that is resilient and drives innovation. And we've really baked that into our application process as well, and ensuring that through the application process, one of the standards is, commercial viability, but also resiliency, and looking at things like their cybersecurity resiliency and how are they vulnerable to supply chain gaps and disruptions. So as we've stood up this program, we have appreciated input and cooperation with our partners and allies. We will continue to do that. Just some examples, President Biden hosted the Prime Minister of India, with technological collaboration and leadership being a major focus. And then recently during the D20 summit underscored the importance of building resilient semiconductor supply chains. In March, Secretary Raimondo also visited India, where she signed an MOU on semiconductor supply chains and innovation partnerships to advance our work together. And then in May, along with Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and U.S. Trade Rep Ambassador Tai, she joined European Union leaders for the fourth ministerial meeting of the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, in which they affirmed that investments in the semiconductor industry on both sides of the Atlantic enhance the resilience of our respective supply chains. So, really looking at this through many fronts, through our application process, through our program development, and through our relationships with our partners and allies. And then to that end, certainly looking at how we leverage our leadership and how we work with our leadership to ensure it's a top-down approach as well.
And Jimmy, from the industry side, is there any, not in the antitrust term, of course, but any coordination going on between the companies and you guys to ensure that this patchwork really is being covered in a helpful way?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously for the antitrust reason, this really is a government to government conversation. But the industry does look at the long-term trends for the effects of non-market capacity and what that might mean for the health of the industry. I think we've learned our lesson really over the last several decades in the industry, in that the government can have a productive role in promoting supply chain resiliency, innovation and workforce, but also can have a disruptive role. And I think there's a difference between the two, and it's significant. I think so far what's happening with the CHIPS Act in the US and Europe and other locations, we see very positive signs that even though the government is incentivizing production, it's still the private sector that's undertaking the majority of the risk and making the majority of the investment. As the CHIPS strategy paper talks about, the grants might only be between 5 and 15% of a project. Even if you have the CHIPS investment tax credit, you're still looking at 60 to 70% of a project that's going to be undertaken by the private sector. So they're not going to make investments, from my perspective, that are going to be loss-making, that are going to introduce new disruptions to the market, create non-market oversupply, because no sort of competent business planner would do so. Where we have to be more careful is when the government really takes up the lion's share of the investment. They start getting involved in investment decisions, management decisions. That's really not in the statute or the remit of any of the CHIPS Act programs that I've seen. However, it is kind of what China's doing. So that's something that we really have to watch out for, is the more state-owned managed model. We really need to let the private companies decide what they want to invest in and how. And the government's role is to really support those investments to make sure that they happen in a geopolitically friendly location and that they can be competitive on a level playing field with the rest of the global market. But if the government is sort of standing up 100% of the capital, sitting on the board, then you're really in kind of, I think, more dangerous territory where you might lead to some cases, market disruptions from non-market capacity. So, I think it's a wait and see approach, and we just have to be very vigilant and work together to prevent that from happening.
Excellent. Well, one thing I want to, and this is a good point of what you just said, Jimmy, that even with the subsidies, building here and building in the EU, really the cost is, there's still a differential from building it in East Asia and certainly building it in China that the subsidies don't cover. Is there thinking within both the government and within industry that these chips might cost more, and what's the thinking on whether consumers are going to be okay with that? Obviously, the economy is a big issue these days. How is the government, and Farouz, maybe I'll start with you, and then maybe turn it over to Jimmy. But how is the government thinking about that and ensuring that there's a message out there to ensure that this is being productive, even if there are maybe higher costs on the manufacturing side?
I mean, first, I guess I'll say that kind of reiterate what I've said so far, and that is, there's something unique about this grant program is, our application process. And that is because it's going to be more iterative than what you usually see from government grants. And so what I mean by that is that each application, while there are eligibility and criteria that we expect to see and have said that we want to see in applications, each application is really going to be looked at in its own, in really trying to understand, what it brings to the local market, to the local ecosystem, how it adds value, how it is catalyzing private investment, its commercial viability, its financial security, so on and so forth. And so I say that to say that, like, it is, it is certainly a piece. It is certainly a part of what those that are reviewing applications will be thinking about and will be looking at. We have risk controls in place as well, again, to ensure that the government subsidies here are just a piece of this puzzle and are just part of what's catalyzing this market. And so and then furthermore, that there will be a negotiation process between the government and the application to ensure that, like, we're able to maximize not just our incentive, but what we're creating and catalyzing here.
Jimmy, any thoughts?
No, I think that was already pretty clear, but I think, we also have to look beyond, whether it's just collaboration on the manufacturing programs to also research development, talent. Those are two major areas where there can be a lot more collaboration and a lot more productive outcomes.
Thank you. And I remind the audience, if you have questions, type them into the chat box. Great panel here to tackle your burning questions. One other topic that I wanted to get into was bringing along other countries. There are a number of mechanisms in place, the TTC, the North American Semiconductor Corridor, State Department doing some diplomacy in this area. How can we leverage CHIPS Act, and as well as some of the subsidies in the other countries, to bring along countries that maybe haven't been into the in the ecosystem quite as much? I saw an article a couple of weeks ago talking about having Mexico perhaps being more part of the ecosystem. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that notion of bringing in sort of non-traditional countries into the supply chain. And Jay, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think just from an analytical side, the International Technology and Security Innovation Fund, the ITSE fund under CHIPS Act, which is $100 million a year over 5 years, administered by the State Department, is a great mechanism for sort of catalyzing some of that investment in partner countries. I've seen some interesting projects working on packaging in Vietnam and in Panama, and so integrating other more diverse partners into the supply chain that way, I think, is a great policy mechanism. And then just to reiterate some of Jimmy's points, a recurring issue of concern for German companies, both in Germany and the United States and elsewhere, is the issue of workforce, the workforce availability. And so making sure that you have the skilled workforce there and available to have these projects occur. So it really, you can have all the investment and the capital and even the facilities, but if you don't have a workforce, then really very little production is going to actually happen at the end of the day. And so for this, German industry stands as, I think, a ready and willing partner, offering a model of successful workforce development through the dual education system, the apprenticeship system. Germany and German industry have signed memoranda of understanding with the Department of Commerce, with the Department of Labor and Education, with the U.S. And the German American chambers here in Chicago and in Atlanta operate very successful apprenticeship networks across industry sectors to help provide the workforce skilling there. So, that's a little bit on the domestic side, in addition to bringing in other partners. But I think it's those kinds of transnational initiatives can be helpful in terms of doing the outreach, the sort of economic diplomacy that you were talking about earlier, Cordell.
And Jimmy, over to you. Jay mentioned Vietnam, and that was obviously the president was over there very recently, signed a memorandum. Do you see any other countries that perhaps are primed to get involved in this?
Yeah, I think there's obviously, countries that have a huge involvement in the supply chain already. That's South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Europe, the United States, mainland China, whether we like it or not, they have a big role, but we'll kind of put them aside for now when it comes to, engagement with supply chain cooperation. And then there's countries that have a burgeoning role or are not less known about, but have a critical role. And that's like Singapore, Malaysia. The chip industry has been there for decades. It's the largest export for both Singapore and Malaysia. And there's countries that really want to do more and maybe poised to do more, like India, Vietnam is in that camp. And then honestly, there's many, many countries that have an ambition to plug into the semiconductor industry. They don't really know how. And they don't really even yet understand what their comparative advantage might be if they did plug into it, but are eager to do so. And I think there's a lot of room across that spectrum for the ITSE fund, the International Technology Supply Chain and Innovation. The International Fund is part of CHIPS. It was $500 million. And the good news is that's already working with countries like Panama, Mexico, Vietnam, hopefully many others, to help them identify those strengths and weaknesses, work together on workforce development, supply chain enablement. I mean, to step into the semiconductor industry takes decades sometimes for a country to be successful. So this really is a long-term vision that the US and its partners have to have.
Yes, and Jay mentioned the workforce issues, and again, as Kelly said at the top of the meeting, stay tuned for that. We'll certainly be discussing that in the next couple of months as we roll this out. I did want to get in. You mentioned China, Jimmy, and that's of course one of the great issues in the industry right now. And recently, Huawei announced, actually, while Secretary Raimondo was abroad, that it had through SMIC had done a 7-nanometer chip all domestically. I'm curious on your thinking on whether that's going to have any effect on A, how countries react, and B, how the government might react. As again, as a former commerce lawyer, I would be cautious in asking Farouz to answer that question. So Jimmy, why don't I turn it over to you?
Yeah, well, obviously it's an important and complicated issue. The overall issue of export controls and national security. I mean, the role of the industry is for us to help the government understand the technology, the supply chains, our market and business model, so that when they formulate national security related rules, they understand what the impact of them will be on the industrial base, on innovation, on our competitiveness. I mean, these are complex issues. There's always going to be a thick soup of unintended consequences and other things we have to consider. And so that's SI has really been our role over the last number of decades on both many issues on the export control spectrum. When it comes to the export controls on China, obviously, China has a complicated relationship with the US, everything from civil military fusion to human rights issues in South China Sea. And that a more robust definition of national security. And that's, not surprisingly driving a counter strategy here in the US. And so, just as the US government's doing that, protecting its national security interests, we just hope that, it's done in a way that takes into account how that's going to hurt or help the industry, whether or not it's done in partnership with allies. and whether or not it's done in a way that's transparent, effective, and predictable. We don't want the rules to be changing every 6 months. That's just makes it really hard for businesses to plan for the future. Specifically on the SMIC and Huawei 7-nanometer issue, there's been a lot of discussion about that. I'd look at the Tech Insights report. It's a very, detailed report on what that means. That they were able to use some pretty advanced manufacturing techniques to produce this chip, but whether or not it's in large quantities, whether or not it can fill the demand for the domestic market, there's still a lot of unanswered questions. And obviously, the Commerce Department has enforcement issues they have to think about as well. So, hard to really, share more, as we haven't really analyzed this at depth, but that's kind of my initial thoughts on the topic for now.
Well, I had to ask the late breaking questions. Speaking of questions, we've got a couple in here. We've talked about bringing along countries that maybe haven't been brought along in the semiconductor industry, but one that actually is a player in the semiconductor industry and home of ARM. Are any of you, and I'll open this up to the panel, anyone surprised that the UK has been largely quiet in this debate, at least as compared to some other countries? Jay?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can't say that I'd really thought on that front. I think it's, from my perspective, some of maybe the institutional quietness just has to come from the consequences of Brexit and sort of the institutional reshuffling of these various dialogues, the UK no longer being involved in sort of EU-US dialogues. Obviously, the UK is very involved on the AI front. I think also in terms of talking about public investment and subsidies in industrial policy, we're seeing a lot of budgetary pressures, not just affecting the UK, but affecting many countries in Europe, affecting, frankly, the US too, looking at the budget negotiations here. So I think that probably also plays a role. Not to comment too in depth on British domestic politics, not my area of expertise, but just some thoughts there.
Yeah, nor mine. Jimmy, any thoughts on the UK?
Well, I mean, actually, they also have their own CHIPS Act. I think they've allocated about $1 billion to their effort. They have a small but important industry, particularly in specialty materials, power electronics, but obviously a huge champion, ARM, headquartered in the UK. Challenged, they're not a member anymore of the EU, so they have to do a lot of this on their own, but they're trying to stake their way forward and do something that's manageable within their economic constraints. I think they are taking the right approach, saying they can't build a 3-nanometer logic foundry in their backyard, but maybe they can help grow the specialty materials industry they have already. And I think they're really focused on making sure what they have doesn't leave, and that they can find a way to kind of revitalize their nascent but growing industrial base.
Well, we're coming to the end. We've got about 7 minutes left, and hopefully we'll do what few meetings in Washington do, is end on time. So I guess I'll ask a last question, sort of looking forward, and we've got one from the audience on this as well. But CHIPS Act 2. The question from the audience is, among other things, will the U.S. need to continue to invest, and if so, by how much? So, Firuz, why don't I start with you and see if you have a view? No, I'm going to hit all of you with it, so be ready.
Sure. I'll probably have the most brief answer to this, given that, we tend not to kind of comment on either ongoing legislation or, further funding from Congress. I will say that certainly the $52 billion was a historic investment, and, we're trying to maximize through our implementation process. And while I'm sure many of us would love to see more money and more invested, and certainly I've heard a lot about more investments on the Science Act part and on the R&D side. I think for us, it's just kind of focusing on what's been allocated thus far, and then going from here.
Well, for all the reasons we've talked about today, you guys have a tall task ahead of you. You've managed to do quite a lot, and I will endorse wholeheartedly. I'm pleasantly surprised with how fast you guys have been able to scale up and get moving, just knowing that the Commerce Department has not historically done things like this. So it's been good to watch from the outside. Jay, how about you?
Please tell your friends. Spread that
I
word.
do.
Sure.
Jay, how about you? Looking ahead, is there going to be a need for further investment here?
To play forecaster a little bit, I think more investment in this area will likely be needed. I think to take the German example, which I do have a little bit more intimate knowledge of, Germany is also facing a lot of pressures on its public budget and is really looking in terms of economic competitiveness measures, looking at other ways of trying to move the needle there. So reducing bureaucratic burden on businesses in terms of permitting or even engaging in immigration reform to make sure that they have a sufficient workforce there. I think in the future, just given the changing political environment, any major or large scale investments will probably be more partisan or more politically contentious. And I think that's going to be true on both sides of the Atlantic.
Probably the safest prediction, that last point. Jimmy, over to you for the last word.
I think just international collaboration, to echo what everyone has said already, is important, and also recognizing that what we're doing at home has global implications, and that what's happening globally has implications for back here. And we just need to be coordinated, up to speed, and aware of just what the dynamics are in each of these key economies. So really, thanks again for the opportunity to be part of this, and look forward to the continued conversation.
Well, thank you all. Let me thank my panelists, the Wilson Center, the STIP program, the WABA Institute of Strategic Competition, and the Europe program. And let me thank all of you for joining us. Again, as Kelly said, this is the first in a series of discussions about the CHIPS Act that will start taking place over the fall. We look forward to having you there, and everyone gets a few minutes back. Have a wonderful day.